Hello and welcome to a very special recorded event. Broadcasting legend Sir David Attenborough gave a speech on the future of public service broadcasting from Millbank Tower in London, and BBC Parliament were there.
Trick number one. The title I've been given for this lecture is The Future of Public Service Broadcasting, or, to give it today's fashionable acronym, PSB. Fortunately, Ofcom, in the person of its chief executive, Ed Richards, has defined PSB for us. He says that it's broadcasting that aims to do four things: to increase our understanding of the world, to stimulate knowledge and learning, to reflect the cultural identity of the United Kingdom, and to ensure diversity and alternative viewpoints. Well, you could argue that good situation comedies like Porridge increase our understanding of the world, that gardening programs stimulate knowledge and learning, that EastEnders and Coronation Street reflect a cultural, UK cultural identity, and that even reality television, such as I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, ensures diversity and alternative viewpoints. But I'm pretty sure that programs like those are not what Ofcom means by PSB. There must be something missing in that definition, and I suspect that we all know what it is. When we talk about PSB these days, we're referring to programs that, for one reason or another, only attract small audiences. I've been unable to discover who first used the phrase public service broadcasting, or when they did so. But those of us who were working for BBC Television back in its early days in 1952 would certainly have said that it was a fair description of what we were doing. We didn't use the phrase very much because we didn't need to define our kind of television. BBC Television was the only kind of television that there was in this country. We were a monopoly. All television in those days came from two small studios up in North London in Alexandra Palace. It was all black and white, of course, and produced very coarse-grained pictures, 405 lines instead of the later 625 lines. It was also all live, because there was no form of recording, at least none that produced pictures of a transmittable quality. The cameras we had, not just the design, but the very pieces of metal, were the very first cameras in the world to have produced a publicly broadcast television service. And very quaint they were. They were filled not with tiny transistors, but large glowing glass valves, and they were each the size of a very large suitcase. They were alarmingly unreliable and constantly breaking down, even during transmission, so that you could start directing your program with 4 cameras and end it desperately improvising with just 1 or even 2. The main camera was able to move around because it was mounted on bicycle wheels and had a second man to push it. The others were supported on awkward pedestals with casters and had to be shoved around by the cameraman himself. And then there was one that was virtually immobile, called the Iron Man. Each had only a single lens with no zoom, and to get a decent close-up of a speaker, the camera, believe it or not, had to be within 2 or 3 feet of him or her, unless, of course, you put on a special close-up attachment. But that took 10 minutes, and you couldn't really do it during transmission, though I must say that some of us occasionally tried to. But with such equipment, and from those 2 small studios, came an extraordinary output of great ambition and variety. There were, of course, quizzes and music recitals, interviews, and discussion programs. Remarkably, there was also every week a play, usually a special production of one that had originally been written for the commercial theatre. The production had its premiere, usually on a Sunday, and then, because there was no way of recording it, it was given a second live performance all over again later in the week. There were also formats that have disappeared entirely. Short stories, read by an actor sitting in an armchair. Variety shows, for at that time music halls were still flourishing, and from them we could import jugglers and ventriloquists and comics and dancing girls. Distinguished scientists came to give illustrated lectures on physics and chemistry. And in addition to our studios, of course, we also had outside broadcast units that covered sport and public events and took people on tours of historic buildings. Perhaps most extraordinary of all to a modern viewer was the fact that there was no regular pattern to the schedules, no stripping of programme across the week. One thing you could be pretty sure of, this Wednesday's programme line-up seldom bore any resemblance to that shown last Wednesday. And starting times, as listed in the Radio Times, were not much to go on, since total breakdowns were not uncommon, and viewers might have to be treated to 10 minutes or so of a kitten playing with a ball of wool, a windmill slowly revolving its sails, or hands moulding clay on a potter's wheel. And we had very little film. Technically, telecine, the apparatus for showing film, was still fairly primitive and produced rather low-quality, grainy pictures. Only 35mm film. The gauge used by the cinema was tolerable. 60mm was not. But 35mm film was very expensive. Our bosses in Broadcasting House took the view that we had been given our electronic toys to play with in our studios, and we shouldn't demand cash for film as well. Television, in their view, was electronic and live. But we felt we had a very direct link with our audience. Not every household had a television set, of course. For the nation as a whole, it was still a novelty. But travelling back home through North London at night, after having directing a programme, we could spot that blue electronic glow in the windows of some of the houses, and we'd know for sure that people in those rooms had been looking at the very programme that we had directed earlier that evening. And what's more, that they had bought a special television licence in addition to their sound licence, as you had to do in those days, in order to do so. And the next morning, as you travelled back to the studios by tube or waited for a bus, everybody was discussing the same programmes that they'd been watching the previous evening, because there were no others. And sometimes that programme was yours. Incidentally, it's interesting to reflect when there's talk these days as to whether it's proper for the BBC to use licence money to subsidise new broadcasting developments, that then most of television's money came not from television licences, of which there were comparatively few, but from the sound radio licence. We took ourselves and our responsibilities very seriously. We thought that our schedules ought to be very varied and cover as wide a range of interests as possible. It was obvious that some programmes would be more popular than others, but we thought that potential popularity should not be the only reason for scheduling a programme. We thought, too, that we could play a key role in modern democracy by enabling a stockbroker in Surrey to understand what a fisherman in the north of Scotland might be feeling, and vice versa. And we would be able to broaden horizons, introducing people to subjects that they might never have encountered, and bringing them new pleasures and new delights. That was because audience research had discovered that once a family sat down to watch television, they tended to stay there, viewing whatever appeared on the screen until shut down. Indeed, it was not unknown for our production secretary, as we were directing a programme in the control room, to be handed a message to say, from the telephone switchboard, to say that they found our programme really rather boring and asking how long it was going to go on for. We certainly knew that on special occasions,